I love this.
So I think we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful we have 60 people with us to enjoy the keynote address for the 25th annual exhibition of art by Michigan prisoners. My name is Nora Kranicki. I am the director of the Prison Creative Arts Project, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to celebrate our first ever digital exhibition, and to hear from the exhibition co-founder and senior curator, Janie Paul. So first, just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to ask everyone during the lecture to please keep yourself on mute. If you would like, I've made live closed captioning available. You should see an option at the bottom of your Zoom window to enable that if you would like to. After Janie finishes her keynote address, we will have an opportunity for some question and answer and conversation. If you'd like to ask a question, you can indicate that in the chat, and we will facilitate a Q&A and welcome people to unmute themselves, ask their question aloud if you are comfortable doing that. Before I turn things over to Janie, I want to thank so many people who've made this exhibition possible, this event possible, in what has been just the most difficult year for all of us, I think is fair to say. The 25th annual exhibition was meant to be hung in the gallery in Ann Arbor 1 year ago. It was just days before the exhibition was meant to open that the United States shut down due to coronavirus. We have held the art in the 25th annual exhibition for 1 year, hoping that we might exhibit it in person this March, which has not been possible, but instead we are just overjoyed to be able to offer the first ever digital exhibition of art by Michigan prisoners. So while it's been certainly disappointing not to be together in person, it has been also just thrilling and so exciting to see the positive responses that we've gotten to the digital show, to see people quite literally all over the country purchasing art, enjoying art, people all over the world enjoying the virtual show, people from all over the world gathering at our virtual events like we are tonight. So I'm grateful that, despite the many challenges we continue to face, PCAP is still really living its mission to bring people together across seemingly insurmountable distances. So of course, I want to thank all of our PCAP staff members, Vanessa Mayeski, Mary Heinen McPherson, Fernanda Pires, and Graham Hamilton, who have really just risen to the challenge this year, keeping PCAP going during a year of quarantine. Our curator group remains as creative, innovative, energetic as ever. They curated the show that you can see online now and have kept their artistic energy going this year as well, which has been really gratifying to see that group innovate, be creative about their new projects, even though we've had an unusual year at PCAP. I hope that everyone has had a chance to view the digital exhibition. I've included a link to it here on our welcoming slide, and we will certainly also add that link to the chat after Janie's lecture has concluded. So with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Janie Paul. Janie is first and foremost an artist. She is the co-founder of the annual exhibition of art by Michigan prisoners and its senior curator. She is a professor emerita of the Stamp School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan, where her teaching career included studio art classes, classes in which she brought students into prison to facilitate art workshops, and classes where she brought students to Detroit through the Detroit Connections program. During her career at the university, Janie received a U of M Diversity Award as well as an Arthur F. Thurnau professorship. Her keynote address tonight is drawn from her forthcoming book that reflects on 25 years of the annual exhibition. Please join me in giving Janie a warm welcome as she delivers her keynote address, Art in Prison, Surviving Mass Incarceration.
Thank you. Thank you, Nora. Hi, everybody. I'm just thrilled to have you all here, old and new friends, and to share with you what I've been thinking about for the past few decades doing this work with incarcerated artists. Now, imagine that you go into a prison and you walk through the yard next and you see wonderful pieces of art. I'm going to show 3 pieces just initially so you get a feeling for the artwork in case you haven't seen it. So you walk into this room, you're in a chapel or a classroom, and art is laid out on the tables, and you see next, I'm saying next because Nora is advancing the slides while I talk to you. Nora, you can just go through these 3. Okay. So imagine that you just walk in, you see these incredible things. Wouldn't that be just really fantastic? And that's what we get to do as curators. We travel around all over Michigan to all 28 prisons. And we meet with the artists, we select their work, we bring it back, and we prepare it for exhibition in March of every year. So this all started in 1996 when my husband, Buzz Alexander, and I decided to organize an exhibit of art by Michigan prisoners. And we had no idea what we were going to see, but we were very impressed and moved. That year, there were 77 works of art by 50 artists from 16 prisons. And this year, we're exhibiting over 800 pieces of art by over 600 artists from all 28 prisons. So this project has impacted thousands and thousands of people, has grown tremendously over these years. Now, Buzz and I came to this project as educators who previously had both been involved in creating spaces where people could come together to find their humanity with each other, to bring themselves out into the open, mostly for various kinds of marginalized people in our society. And so our concept for the exhibit was to make it a pedagogical as well as a curatorial project. So we instituted things that we still do today. After we collect the art and it's all processed and photographed, there's a lot more than those just 2 words that go into all this work. And we put the exhibition up. We photograph every piece in the show, including photographs of the opening reception. And we make a video that's sent out to every prison where it's shown over closed circuit TV. So everyone can see, everyone around the state can see this work. We also do other things to give feedback to the artists. We have a comment book that's very important. So people can write comments in the comment book, and that is sent to the artists. So we have various kinds of events of contact where we stay in touch with the artists and they really feel like we're with them. And I think the fact that we've shown up for 25 years and we haven't backed off is one of the most important things here, is that so many people who are incarcerated have had so many disappointments and have had people who didn't show up. But this now has become an event that they can depend on, that goes forward with them. So the goals of our exhibition, one is to support the artists and give them ongoing validation for their artistic and their personal growth. 2 is to create a community that bridges the walls. And 3 is to provide an opportunity for people in the public, viewers, to see this art and appreciate the humanity of people who are living in prison, hopefully being a first step toward ending mass incarceration. Now, you can go to the next slide, Nora. I know this looks like, what are we talking about here? But I'm going to touch on some basic dynamics that underlie this exhibition that relate to childhood. And you'll see my point in a couple of minutes. So when a very young child is with its mother, very young, there's really no differentiation between the baby and the mother. And you can see here, this Guatemalan woman is holding her baby close while she sorts coffee beans. There's a progressive individuation of that little child, which is a strain. There's a, it's not easy. So next slide. The child usually has, I just couldn't see that image for a minute. The child usually has that transitional object, the blanket or the stuffed animal, something that's so important. And the psychiatrist Donald Winnicott called that the transitional object, which is a way that the child transitions into the outer world. And then next slide. The other dynamic that's so important is mirroring. Here you can see this wonderful image of the father and the baby looking at each other. And the baby is seeing himself reflected in the father's eyes and able to feel his true self as the father looks to him. So obviously not all parenting is perfect, and many children grow up without this. But the reason why I mention this is because in teaching art to both children and adults, I realized that these concepts are very important. Next. When children make art, and particularly three-dimensional objects, if they haven't had a good background, if they've been lacking in some emotional support, this object also often becomes a very important kind of transitional object. And some children that I worked with ended up carrying these objects around with them, and they've just become incredibly attached to them. Next. The other thing I realized is that the whole show, the whole exhibit project is kind of a way of mirroring. It's a way of people, of the artists inside being recognized. We see them and they are seen as valuable people. And a lot of people didn't have that mirroring experience as children. And so this is a really big dose of that for people. So, okay, let's go on now. We're going to look at some images of incarceration by some of the artists. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you some quotes for what they say about their work. So this work is by Brian Picken, an artist who's out now. And he says, I created this piece to express my thoughts about transitioning into prison, about the bleakness of advancing through the system, about being caged, deprived of the right to humanity, and being restricted to a forgotten section of nothingness. It's a very surreal, a very traumatic experience. Next. Carmen Valentine says, the arrow has been shot from the back and come through the front. I was abused and betrayed, and so that is why the arrow is coming from the back. I'm touching the arrow because the pain is my constant companion. I lived with it before I came into prison, and I live with it now. Next. Alvin Smith says, as an incarcerated African-American male and having been on the inside for over 20 years, it would be easy for me to be a conduit for hate and blame. But those things steal not only from my ability to cope, but my ability to create at all. And so I composed this piece entitled Evolution of Inequity to point out how this incarceration system was derived from this history of Black Americans. However, this same incarceration system now affects all in the same way. And can you see the image? You can tell the connection between slavery and incarceration. So an interesting thing about people who go into prisons, me and my colleagues and people around the country that I know who do arts work or other kind of work, we're often asked, why do we do this? And I know that most of us feel oddly rejuvenated and good after these visits. We feel bad, of course, that we're leaving and the people inside are staying. We feel bad about the suffering and people talking with people who are in prison for life or for 40 years. But when we leave, the rejuvenation comes from a few different things. One is, of course, that we're meeting very wise, intelligent people who've had a lot of time to reflect, and we've had wonderful conversations, and we value them. But there's something else that I've realized recently that I just have been able to put into words recently. And what it is that it feels better to engage with what I see as the nexus of our core American problem than to ignore it and pretend it isn't there. Prison is really at the heart of our country's cruelty, because the origin story of our country, the Declaration of Liberty and Justice for All Men, actually excluded anyone who was not a white man with property. Over the next centuries, these exclusions supported the cruelty of the Indian Wars, slavery, Jim Crow, the exploitation of Chinese workers and poorer European immigrants, the Japanese internments, the new Jim Crow, and now recently, the migrants at the border. But over this, reality has been drawn a veil of illusions. That's the myth of normalcy, the pursuit of happiness, and the exceptionalism of our country. This dominant white culture tells the history of our country without these atrocities, or as a whitewashed or erroneous version. Our particular form of incarceration, of course, was formed during slavery and the Black codes and Jim Crow. So it is a system of racism, but it has drawn poor people, mentally ill people, and various kinds of marginalized people into its net. So prisoners are actually the people who understand this lie the best. They face it every day, excluded from the ability to vote, to lead a healthy life, and to be subjected to arbitrary and physical violence. So for me, it feels good to be with the people who know what this lie is and who are resisting it every day by calling what they denying at the what I point when I was looking at all of these images, that you can go to the next slide. That art is a form of longing, is a form of expressing longing of all of the unmet needs that prisoners have. Some people say, oh, well, they get fed and they get clothed and they, have a roof over their head, but the most important human needs are not being met. So I'm just going to show you how I feel incarcerated artists are resisting by embodying these needs that go unmet in prison. So artists resist displacement with images of home, belonging, and community. Next. They resist being anonymous with images of themselves and their heritage. Next. You see Oprah with all of her forebears inside. Next. Artists resist apathy with critiques of our culture. Next. Artists resist being undervalued by becoming fully dedicated to their craft and to learning new skills. This artist drew 16 hours a day beginning from knowing nothing about drawing to producing works like this. Next. They resist despair with images of faith. Next. Next. Artists resist separation with images of love and affection. Next. They resist tedium with humor and wild imaginings. Next. Next. In resistance to scarcity, artists retain fond memories in great detail to nourish themselves. Just a note here, this artist, when he paints those little people in this great family reunion, he paints them naked and then he puts their clothes on them. And it's just a wonderful kind of process, I think, of the actual construction of these people and these things that he's remembering. Next. So let me just get my notes up again. So how does all this wonderful art come about? Well, there are a few layers of reasons why people make art in prison. So just so you know, those of you who aren't familiar with this, people are making art in prisons all over the country and perhaps the world. I just don't know for sure. But even without people going in to help people make art, there has been a tradition of art making in prisons for generations. And there are traditions that are handed down, that are taught. There's a lot of learning going on in prisons. And for the most part, people are very generous with their learning. So the first reason why people make art in prison is economic. Art making is the legal way to make money in prison. There are a lot of illegal ways to make money in prison. The problem is that people who have jobs, and most people, but not all people have jobs, make hardly any money. For example, someone who's a porter, that is, who cleans, might make $8 to $10 a week. The higher paying jobs, like a law librarian or a clerk, might make $70 or $80 a month. But with art, for example, card making is one of the biggest genres going on. With cards, people can make cards and sell them for anywhere from $2 to $20. And if a person is really good, when holidays come around, they can stock up and make, many, many cards and sell them all and make hundreds of dollars, actually. So, and here you see Eddie Medrano made the card on the left, which has a kind of standard imagery that's used in tattooing and in card making, the rose, very nicely done. And then the one on the right is by an artist named Rick, who makes a lot of cards for his friends outside. And he made this one for my husband, Buzz. So next, we will look at the other traditional genre, which is tattooing. And I don't have a slide of, I don't have an image of an arm or a back with a tattoo, but this is a really marvelous example of a drawing that's done with tattoo imagery. It includes the kind of Celtic designs. And I feel like it has just this great energy radiating out of the heart of the Christ figure. Next, the third money-making art form is portraits. People learn to make portraits and they practice their skill, and like this one, do them very realistically with great shading. And they send these portraits. So the way it works is that you might have a portrait, a little picture of your daughter, or your son, or whoever it is, and you bring it to me, I'm the artist, and I make a drawing from that portrait, and then you can send it home. And I once asked one of our artists, King Hood, why did he think people wanted to see a drawing rather than a photograph of a loved one? And he said, it's because they want to see that you see something in that person that they also see of value. So I thought that was really interesting. Interestingly, if you think about all of these three art forms, they all have to do with a connection to people. Cards are meant to send home to loved ones. Tattooing is really a way of being identified with a group, of feeling like you belong with a specific group, an identification, and also uses symbols that have meaning. And portraits are also sent home to loved ones. So all of these forms are about connection to people. Next, this is another example of a photograph, of a drawing from a photograph, where you can see how definitely it was done from a photograph, and what a happy thing it would be to receive that drawing of the family. So next, the other really big thing in prison is making three-dimensional craft objects. These are also sold and sent home. This is a jewelry box that opens up and has lots of little drawers where jewels can go. And there's all kinds of things. There's crocheted handbags and iPad covers and teddy bears and all kinds of things. And there are, what do you call the thing you put money in? Piggy banks in the form of houses. And that's a big market too. So now you can picture that there's this very active art market going on in prisons almost every day, but especially around our holidays. And because the market competition in the traditional genres of prison art is so intense, individual artists are motivated to become highly skilled so they can be the ones that get the work. And when I asked artist Robert Fitzner why there is such a high skill level among the artists, this is what he said. He said, there's so many artists and hustlers in here, all at different levels, and the one distinction is their quality of work. The only true currency we have in here is what we can do best, whatever that may be, and what we do better than others is what gives us that competitive edge. And when I asked Danny Valentine why he thought the rules were sometimes bent for artists, because this is true, artists receive a lot of respect and prestige in prison, both from inmates and from some of the guards, not all of them. But he said, in answer to my question, everyone loves art. The most violent gangbanger, the hustler, the strictest guard, everyone, because it's a human expression. They admire it and most want it. Okay, next. I'm going to read you a quote from Susan Brown, who does her work with beads, thousands of little beads. And she also makes jewelry that she sells. And here she describes her financial situation and her art in prison. I make and sell beaded jewelry to sustain myself in here, and I work with beads in 2 and 3 dimensions to make my art. If I don't want to sell jewelry to a particular person, I raise the price. I sell bracelets for as low as $150, though I don't like to. The most expensive is about $125. I have respect here and can count on my sales. If I keep to my budget, I can eat as I want and save my money for phone calls and beads. I don't go to chow. I spend $2 a day for food at the store. A month's worth of food is $60, so I have to make that much for my jewelry or other beadwork. For breakfast, I have a cereal bar and coffee. For lunch, I have ramen noodles with cheese and beans. For dinner, I have mackerel. If I want to splurge, I don't eat for one day and I save $4. And then I have bacon on a tortilla sheet with rice. So there's a very graphic example of how art and money are connected in prisons. But now let's look at the deeper emotional reasons why people make art. Okay, next. So since prehistory, the arts have given shape to meaning. Visual artists who use pictorial subject matter exercise a very basic human need to abstract, to grasp the essential qualities, characteristics of things and phenomena in the world. Next. To choose and make just the right marks that create the energy and essence of a horse, a tree, a sun, a human gesture is incredible and uniquely human. Next. Non-representational abstract images also give shape to qualities and emotions because all visual elements come from the world we live in and resonate with our experiences. Next. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of shaping, because all of us shape our environment and our time in ways. We organize our bureaus and our side tables, our bedside tables, our tool chests, our gardens. We're always creating designs with form. And we do that with time as well, how we organize our time and our rituals. John Dewey wrote in Art Experience about an essential aspect of this. He said, we have an experience when we feel it run its course, when it has a beginning, middle, and end. A good conversation, a good meal, a good walk through the woods is remembered as meaningful and whole. It has a shape. And artist Wynne Satterley explains how this worked for him through art. Art was the first thing I could find in my life that upon completion, I had instant satisfaction. When I sign the canvas, I can feel satisfaction. I can feel a form of a journey coming to an end. Very few encounters in life ever gave me that, but art did. When activities are done mindlessly, when experiences are disjointed and lack specificity and texture, life can go by with little satisfaction. In prison, time and space have no meaningful shape because order is only imposed by rules and restrictions, not by personal choice. But art is not only about shaping, it's a sustained process of making decisions, which is a kind of liberty in prison. Decisions one after another about materials and marks, textures, colors, shapes, and surfaces. A person can choose to be slow and methodical or fast and spontaneous. Next slide. Can you go to the next one? Okay. You get sustenance from the smallest things, a leaf that blows into the yard, birds, squirrels, pet mice. You see this guy with his pet mice? Can you see that? This is a guy who actually trains mice and builds them these little cages out of and little toys out of found materials. You have to look inside yourself to experience for experiences that have shape and meaning. One man told me, there is no middle ground here. You're either moving forward or going back. And being an artist is one of the best ways of moving forward because you can create an internal space for yourself for growth and freedom. Next. So I'm reading now from a chapter in my book. The urge to create meaning, to have a sense of order and form, to exert control, and to discover new parts of oneself drives people to create a momentary yet solid world of the imagination. Fitting together marks, forms, colors, stories, and images offers a sense of understanding, of worth and value, of things being just right, which of course is rare in prison. Artists may use carefully honed skills and techniques, or they may work in a flash of intuition. For all of them, it is the single experience they have of being fully themselves. Incarcerated people make their art in small, crowded rooms, often with other people around. They must learn to cultivate an intense relationship with their work in order to sustain the feeling of being an intimate relationship to something that matters. Once an artist makes the first mark or makes the first move on a piece of wood or soap or plaster, she engages in an ongoing interaction with the art object. Responses to the physical result of these interactions can be a range of feelings such as joy, anger, curiosity, frustration, or contentment. This process affords a continuous range of emotional states that are entirely private, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, flowing in and around the artist, and this is intensely satisfying. The art object begins as the recipient of the artist's actions and gradually takes on a separate identity that eventually says, I am done. This vital back and forth of action and response is a way of being in true and intimate relationship, something that is rare among humans living in prison. This precious process and relationship to the art object is directly opposite from the ways in which incarcerated people are treated as objects to be moved around, literally held in cages when they are transferred between prisons, and in innumerable other humiliating ways. In the art process, the artist is the creator, making a precious object that is imbued with meaning. Next. If the project of being a person is to evolve into more humanness, to open up increasingly more inner resources, more knowledge, more experience, then it is to look forward towards the future. In John Berger's novel, A Painter for Our Time, Janos, the painter, says, there is something even more fundamental than sex or work, the great universal human need to look forward. Take the future away from a man and you have done something worse than killing him. To see only more and more of the same institutionalized life as you head into the future is agonizing. This is the ultimate punishment for prisoners, particularly those serving long or life sentences. And so prison artists develop a practice in which one work of art leads to another, pointing them towards a path of endlessly unfolding possibilities, an enduring, if momentary, feeling of being grounded in the world. Next. I'm going to now read you a passage from something that Oliver Merker wrote to me. Oliver is the one that did this painting you're looking at. And I'm going to be showing you two paintings as I read his passage. I thought when I came into prison, I was angry that I wasn't treated fairly because I didn't shoot the gun. My friend did. I was justifying myself. As years went by, I realized I could have stopped it, but I was a prisoner of my ego. I realized I was guilty, but now I'm free. I have nothing to prove, no ego. I realized the smallest conflict can result in a violent situation. It takes two to escalate, so you just walk away. A guy got his TV stolen and got angry and wanted to get into a fight. And I said, just don't go after him. Just read a book. I stay all out of all that. People leave me alone. I just think about art. You can go to the next painting. I've changed so much as a person. I was totally hopeless, drifting with no direction. It's ironic that I had to make a bad decision and come to prison to change for the better. I have parolable life. It really shakes you up to get that sentence. I started thinking more in depth, analyzing myself, becoming better. And when I discovered art, everything opened up. Now I paint for 3 or 4 hours a day and don't even want to stop, even if it's chow time. And I don't want to go, but have to go. Through art, I started centering myself. It's a real second life, more than an escape. And so this is me now. This is something that I've seen with a variety of people over the last 25 years, that I've had the opportunity to be with people for decades. And I see that as meaning in their work grows and develops, that also happens in their life. And they can live differently in prison, just as Oliver described, and when they get out. Now, I'm going to talk about the exhibitions a little bit, and we'll just stay on the same beautiful painting. The exhibition really extends unconditional kindness to people in prison, which is in opposition to the criminal justice system, which focuses on the worst part of every person. And whether or not they deserve kindness is totally irrelevant to us. We don't ever ask people what their crimes are. We don't want to know. Why should, we know that about them. They don't know what the worst thing is about us. And we want to make this a totally equal situation. Plus, we want to meet face to face as humans to build on our common humanity. I do think that one of the best things that we've done, as I said before, I think, is that we've shown up every year for 25 years, and it's embedded in their lives, and we can go forward with them into the future, which, as I've just explained, is a very important feeling. And that we are, as I described before with the concept of mirroring, that we're basically mirroring back to them and saying, you have value. We know, we may not know really who you are, but we know this part of you. Something that goes along with it is what I think of as naming, which is a really important part of the curatorial process, which is really an educational thing. It's related to the mirroring idea, that when I'm looking at a piece of art by somebody, particularly somebody in prison, I name what I'm seeing. I'll say, I see that you've really done a lot of shading here, or that you really have used these colors in this way, to say back to them what they have done, but they maybe can't articulate for themselves. And especially, this is especially important for people whose work we don't take, and most of those are beginners. Because when I say, well, we've decided not to take your work, but I want to talk about it a little bit, and I see that you've really worked hard at this, whatever it is, line, shading, color, and I really appreciate this. It just, whatever reason, I go into why we're not taking it. But by the end of the conversation, the person is usually very excited because of how I have talked to them and have reflected back who they are, which turns out to be equally as important as being in the show that year, and hopefully they'll be in the show the next year. Another thing I've thought about a lot is that the exhibition is really two cultures coming together, which is a wonderful thing, and also can be hard to negotiate, because there's the culture of art in prison, which has its own customs and traditions and values. And then there's the culture of PCAP and the artists who are curators and what our backgrounds are. And so we, from the beginning, could see that it was a very tight, it was a, what do you call it, a tightrope balancing act. We wanted to respect the traditions that were going on in prison, but some of those traditions became stereotyped and not original. So we tried to find ways to help people expand on those traditions, but we also wanted people to open up their minds about what other kinds of art could be done. And you see this negotiation of the two cultures in the selection visits. For example, we may be looking at a person's work, and we've decided to take a piece that was done in less time than another piece. And the artist will say, well, why are you taking this one? I spent like 20 hours on this one. And then we'll need to explain what we see of value in the one that we're taking, but also explain what we see in the value of the other one. And, we're not always right. Sometimes, I remember a time when this exact same scenario happened, and then somebody else came over to another curator, went to that curator and say, but that person just really has so much invested in that piece. I think we should take it. But you see what I'm saying? There are different values that are coming together. And the reason why it's great that we have time to talk with each other at the facilities is that so that we can talk this all through. I love going into these prisons and seeing the work because I'm an artist, and most of what I do is drawing and painting. And I can really relate because most of the work we're seeing is drawing and painting. And I'm very interested in the techniques and the formal qualities as well as the content of the works. And so I began reflecting on the question of, is there an aesthetic to prison art? How or not? How do the circumstances of isolation and confinement take on special meaning? The need to assert one's identity, the urgency to create meaning. Do these influence the work itself? How does living in prison affect individual mark making, brush strokes, etc.? How are incarcerated artists both distinctive because they're living in prison and also just like artists in the world? So I have a chapter in the book that's divided up into different sections about different kinds of work, and I'll just talk about a few of them. But the first thing is, excuse me, I have to get a cough drop, is about visual language, and you can go to the next slide. So a colleague of mine who's a painter and I were looking at this drawing by Wayne Farren, Everything on the Table. And he was saying, this is so poignant. It's about his addiction. And we agreed that the poignancy came from not only the content, but the choices that he made about how to make the drawing. All of the objects on the table are not touching. They're all the different symbols, objects of addiction. But above him is a painting that he made up of this cupcake, which is looks so delicious and is so joyous. And he, in that painting, all the forms are touching each other and are bumping up against each other. He also developed a distinctive way of creating form. If you notice, every form in the piece is outlined and then colored in. And that was his own way of one part of his visual language. He also made the drawing in orange and blue, which are the colors of prison uniforms. His gaze is very poignant, looking at us. So this artist clearly didn't spend years studying anatomy, doesn't have formal training. But the fact that he's developed a visual language really makes his work stand out. It doesn't matter how much training somebody has. The value of a piece of art is whether somebody has invested in it and developed their own kind of visual language. So particularly in prison, this is so important because it means I have a unique language for myself. This is me. I'm here. I'm real. Next. So here's an artist, Billy Brown. I know a couple of you have pieces by him, who developed this incredible way of drawing. And his story is that he was trying to learn conventional drawing techniques from someone, and he just couldn't get it. And the guy said, well, Billy, you're just going to have to, create something of your own. And so he said he prayed and he had a vision, and it just came to him. And he started drawing with colored pencils, on construction paper. And his technique, which is incredibly disciplined, is to make each mark, to press more at the beginning of the mark than the end of the mark, so that you can see the color of the construction paper coming through. And it looks like embroidery. And this is an incredibly unique visual language that he developed with such motion and grace. Next. Another characteristic of a lot of the work done in prisons is intense labor, workmanship, perfection, and detail. This is a painting by Scott Fabian. And he did incredibly detailed paintings of wildlife. And that background color, he said, was made up of 10 washes, laid one over another to give this incredibly sort of vibrant gray. Next. And three-dimensional work, there's also incredible detail. These two pieces by Samantha Baczynski are the result of her learning how to crochet in prison. She started out not knowing anything, and then she used patterns, and then she went off on her own and she made this beautiful wedding dress, which is very poignant because she's a lifer, and she said that she will never get married, or she doesn't think she will. She might. So she wanted to make this wedding dress. And then the motorcycle she made without knowing anything about motorcycles. She researched all the parts. She made each part, crocheted each one, and then put them together. So people say a lot, well, people have so much time, they can do this kind of thing. And that is really true. It's a way to take up time, but it's also, in a deeper sense, a way to enter into a sort of deeper psychic state. Next. One of the most sort of amazing experiences for two-dimensional artists is to learn how to shade. And you can, if you think back, all of the genres, the card making, the tattooing, and the portraits all involve learning how to shade, that is, using tones that go from light to dark. This Kevin Babcock piece on the left, I couldn't help but compare to this lithograph by Grant Wood. They're so similar. The thing about shading, there's nothing more miraculous in a way for a beginning artist than to use charcoal or pencil, and with just the mark making, to make something that looks real, to make something that's round and that comes into being. And there's nothing more miraculous than actually me bringing light into being, especially in such a dark place as prison. Okay, next. And this one, Kevin Wiet's Man's Best Friend, is a different way of creating light and dark, just by these tiny little marks that he made that follow the contour of the dog's body and really brings out, I think, the feeling of his love for his dog. Next. Here's another comparison. Also, I couldn't help but compare Dan Mullen's painting on the left with this Hopper painting. Both of them have this feel of this kind of lonely American scene. but I wanted to include this because of the importance of texture. Texture, light and shade is intimately connected to texture, because light can only be created with the physical reality of touching the paper. And texture is super important for artists in prison, because there is no really inviting textures in their world. In the outside world, we have really valuable, endearing textures all around us that have deep stories and histories. But in prison, it's all concrete and plastic and steel, whatever, but there's no deep meaning to any of the textures. So texture is extremely important in both 2- and 3-dimensional work. Next. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is 3-dimensional work, which is really where you see a lot of the ingenuity coming from artists. Anything that can be picked up can be used for art. People use toilet paper, glue, cardboard, bottle caps, dental floss, anything. I'm going to show you a few examples of really wonderful 3D work. But before that, I just wanted to tell you my thoughts about why miniatures are so endearing to us. So many people like little objects. And the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote in one of his books about miniaturization, and said that in the real life, we perceive parts and then we perceive wholes. But when we look at miniatures, we see the whole and then we see the parts. So it's a very pleasurable way of taking something in. It's and it's also a kind of cherishing and being with loved things and experiences. So this deer may not be automatically perfect, but anatomically perfect, but the artist really captures some of the animal's essential features, and he made it out of toilet paper, glue, and acrylic paint. Next. Danny Valentine was in solitary confinement, and this made this 4.5-foot wide mermaid out of toilet paper and glue, working at night in the dark by feel. When it was dry, he painted it black and then dusted over it with a light coat of silver, using a watercolor mop brush to give it a look of pewter. He was in segregation, and some of the guards didn't want him to be working on it, which is why he was working on it at night. And eventually a lieutenant came along that actually appreciated it, and he was able to keep working on it. Next. And Kenneth Mariner makes his tank creations out of cardboard, old folders, thread, glue, tissue, acrylic paint. These are sort of his evocations of what he remembers from old World War II stock footage, depicting bombed out remains. So these are just 3 examples, but they're really the way people use materials is incredibly ingenious. Okay, next. Now I'm going to conclude with just a few thoughts about how we're connected to people in prison and why our connection is so important. So the writer John Berger looks in one of his essays called Meanwhile, writes that he looks for a landmark with which to make sense of our particular time in history. And he says, the landmark I've found is that of prison, nothing less. Across the planet, we're living in a prison. And what he means is that we're all under surveillance and under the domination of the global market forces that are now so exterritorial that they have no connection to what's going on in the ground. They're perpetually remote and never have to take into account the results of their actions. And so they're free from their actions, but they become, because of that, they become anesthetized. So our own forces of resistance have to be local and on the ground. So what we can see, for one thing, is that we're all, people in prison and ourselves are all on a common spectrum. They are at the extreme end, and I and many of us here are at another end where we're pretty comfortable in our lives, and yet we can feel those dominating forces in the air and in our daily lives. So the danger is that we're always in danger of becoming objects in somebody else's world rather than subjects in our own world. And this is where I think that we can gain insight and courage from the artists in prisons. We can look to them for inspiration, for strength and resourcefulness, and for models of resistance. And I think it's incredibly important that we include them in our forward movement and to learn from them about resilience and about this tremendous strength that art can bring to human life. Thank you. That's it.
Yay.
Thank you, Janie. That was just an incredible, enlightening lecture. I know I asked everyone to mute themselves before, but I'm going to ask if you want to unmute yourself and join me in giving Janie just a hearty round of applause. It's well deserved.
Thank you so much for having us. This was wonderful.
Hi.
Hey,
Thank
Janie.
you. Thank you. It's so wonderful to
Thank
see you all now.
Yeah, great.
So we have time for we have time for some questions and conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay as long as anybody wants to stay. Other people can go whenever they want.
So if you'd like to ask a question,
Or
yes,
comment.
or comments. If you have a comment or would like to ask a question, you can just type your name in the chat and we'll shine a light on you. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
It takes a while to think of things, I know.
Michael?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Jamie, I taught economics for a long time. I was intrigued about what you said about the market, as it were, inside the prisons. You said that you were talking about a woman who didn't have to eat, and so she could save money.
Well, she did eat, but she bought from the store because she didn't like the food in the chow hall. And the only time when she didn't eat was when she wanted to save up enough money so she could buy the thing that was more expensive from the store the next day.
So there is a chow hall if they wanted.
Oh yeah, there's a chow hall where everybody eats regularly. They all line up for chow and they go in at specific times, but the food isn't very good. So some people choose to eat food from the store, which is actually only open every 2 weeks.
And then the other question, the follow-up is, do the materials that they use, how do they get them? Do they ask their friends to bring them in? Does the
No,
store
I should have addressed that. They have to buy their own materials. Nothing's provided for them. They can order materials. The only way they can get materials is by ordering them from approved vendors like Dick Blick or Nasco.
And how do they pay it?
It's a good question. I don't know how they pay them. Martin would know. I don't know how it's actually paid, but they have money in their accounts from whatever source they have money. And they, yeah, I'm not sure what the actual, I'm sure there's a system that's worked out. I don't know what it is.
Very interesting, thank you.
Patricia,
Yeah.
would you like to ask a question?
Hello.
Pat, you got to unmute yourself, Pat.
I am unmuted. I didn't know anybody was caught. I
Yeah.
don't know what the system is, but anyway, Janie,
Yes.
I know that you have written about the ways in which artists improve their skill
Mm-hmm.
and how some of the more experienced artists are teaching the younger or the least experienced artists.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about how all this skill building
Yeah.
takes place in an otherwise pretty inhumane place?
Yeah, there is a lot of learning going on and a lot of mentoring. What I've seen is that as people gain skill themselves, they often want to share those skills with people. And I think it's probably because they haven't had the opportunity to do something like that before. Because it is very pleasurable and satisfying to be able to transfer your knowledge to someone else. So people will often sort of connect with a mentor who will teach them. Well, there have been times in some of the prisons where a couple of the inmates have been able to start a class with the approval of the staff. And they get materials from the Inmate Benefit Fund. There are groups of artists that kind of teach each other. There's a great pair that I write about in my book, Win Satterley and Doug Pinson, where Doug Pinson's walking around with an envelope that he decorated, and Win Satterley says, "Oh, that looks great. Are you making art?" And he said, "Oh, no, I'm not." And he encourages him every time he sees him. And then he finally buys the materials for Doug. And Doug starts to paint like things and draw things like he sees on the yard, like the traditional roses and things. And Wynn says, "Oh, you don't have to do that. Just do what's in your head." So this guy is really the opposite of the traditional skill builder, but he encourages Doug, who then does some very expressive paintings. But on the skill building, people just, like that, remember the cell scene in Pencil of the guy standing in this, looking out of the cell. He really taught himself. A guard, actually this happens very occasionally, a guard came by and told him about perspective because he had taken a drawing class. But otherwise, it's just informal gathering in the rec room or wherever it is, and literally sitting next to somebody and having. Eddie Medrano described how he would have somebody sit next to him and watch him draw. And then he said if he saw the glint in the guy's eyes, that meant he really wanted to learn. And that showed him, and then he would start teaching him. But yeah, it was something that when I started doing my research, I really was impressed with, is how much learning and caring there is.
So we've had a couple of questions in the chat about how you got started doing this work. Janie,
Oh.
would you like to talk to that question?
Sure. Before I began doing prison work, I lived in New York, and I worked in a couple of situations where I worked with children and adult. I taught at Parsons School of Design, but I at the Brooklyn Museum and as an artist in residence with a studio in the school program, I worked in very poor areas of New York in public schools and worked with children there and training teachers. And so I also taught in various community centers to adults who were living in underserved areas. So I was pretty committed to that as a general thing in my life. And then I met Buzz Alexander. We met at the Blue Mountain Center in the Adirondacks. And he was doing this work. He founded PCAP in 1990 with a theater workshop. PCAP then sort of started unofficially, and I moved to Ann Arbor to teach at the University of Michigan and also to be with him. And he was doing theater and writing workshops in prisons, and I started doing an art workshop at a men's facility and then women's facility. And when I moved, Buzz had a really deep appreciation of visual art, even though he was a English professor. And when I moved, he said, "Well, now you're here, we can do an exhibit." And so we decided to do that. I had been in South Africa the year before I moved, and I was very moved by, affected by seeing the effects of apartheid. and meeting some people who had been political prisoners. And when I came back, I feel like what happened was my focus on systemic racism was just really sharpened by that visit to South Africa. And I started thinking about going into prisons, and then I met Buzz. So that was a very fortuitous thing that happened.
Phyllis, do you have a question? You can unmute yourself.
Actually, Janie just answered it. I was trying to remember whether you had taught art in the prisons. And is that still part of PCAP at this point?
Oh yeah, it's a big part of PCAP. We have lots and lots of workshops going on in prisons, in theater, writing, visual art. It's a whole separate thing from the exhibit. PCAP has several big projects, and that's one of them, and this is one of them.
Yeah, I guess I had always assumed that the art exhibit came from the art classes, but not really.
It doesn't really, no. I mean, we don't have as many visual art workshops as we do in the other fields. We just don't have as many people doing them. In the beginning, I was teaching a class in which my students did art workshops in prisons. And so there were a few people from those classes, but no, mostly not. It's mostly people are just learning on their own.
Thanks.
Megan, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. And I guess I wanted to know whether there are certain subjects that are not permitted, and then also whether there's oversight of the people when they're making visual art, and then whether this can vary from facility to facility.
Yeah. Okay. You're going to have to remind me of what the first question was.
The first part was whether there are subjects
that
are not permitted.
We have very, I've never known of, yes, I do know. I was going to say I've never known of someone being censored while they were making art, but I do know one artist that was censored because he was doing a painting of how some guards put him in the hole, and they didn't like that, and they destroyed the painting. That doesn't happen all that often. In terms of our exhibit, we do have to send all of the images before we have the exhibit to the Michigan Department of Corrections. And we had a meeting with them where we agreed on what kinds of subject matters would be censored. One of them is showing violence or hatred of officers or staff. Then the other is some sexual, they're pretty lenient about sexuality, but I think we can't show like naked breasts or certain things, but they haven't been that bad. Out of 800 and something pieces, maybe there's 2 or 3, and then we just put them in the bins rather than on the wall, and we don't put them in the video. That can somewhat vary from facility to facility, in terms of artists' work, but there's really not much oversight of the visual artists. It's seen as a pretty safe thing for people to do. And it is. I mean, for the most part, artists don't cause trouble. From a security point of view, the staff are generally happy that people are making art because they're not making trouble in their eyes.
Thank you.
Lisa, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi. Janie, it was so wonderful.
Thank you.
It's incredible. But I'm just wondering, like, some of the things that you said the prisoners said were so insightful and beautiful. I mean, do you have sessions where you talk to them about their work, or I'm not clear.
Did that happen? You mean where? Well, when I
just how did you get all these quotes, and do they get together and talk about it, or?
It's because of the writing of my book, which I started several years ago. In the first year that I did the book, I went around and interviewed. I got permission to go into prisons and interview artists. And I couldn't record. I just had to go in with a legal pad and pencil and scribble as fast as I could. So we had, hour-long interviews. which were permitted. And then I came back and I wrote up the notes and I, kind of edited them. And I also sent out a survey to artists, to like 200 artists that I knew, and they sent them back with a lot of writing. And then it was sort of an iterative process. And a lot of my ideas have happened really in dialogue with the artists. I corresponded quite a bit with some of the artists, and I would ask them questions about what they had said in the interview or what they had said in the survey response. And, with some of them, I just carried on correspondence for years. And, I would test out my ideas too. I'd say, what do you think of this thing I'm thinking about? And they would write back.
Oh, it's interesting. I feel like you've really opened a window for me, because I have no experience with this population at all. And it's so interesting. And it's just fascinating. So I really want to get your book. I can't wait.
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad you came.
Yeah, me too. It's wonderful.
Shawnee, you've put a few questions in the chat. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions? Maybe they're not able to.
Shawnee?
No. Leah, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Janie. That was really beautiful. I just treasured that, and I'm really looking forward to it. It was recorded, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's wonderful, because I want to share it with other people. I have a question about what happens in the prisons among the artists. Do they have any opportunity to share their work with each other outside of doing, like, getting into this exhibit or participating in some of the training? Or are they just isolated from each other?
It depends on what level they're in. So I didn't talk at all about levels, but if they're in level 4, that's a high level. They don't have much access to other people. In the lower levels, 1 and 2, people are in the yard and in the rec room. And that's where a lot of conversation about art takes place. And I heard a story by a couple of young men. They were both in, I forget what you call them, but 8-person cubes, like 8 people in 4 bunk beds. And there was a hallway in between them. And then they were in, and they would hold up their work to each other. And then they would meet sometimes. And they would go out into the yard, and they had a competition going and saying, man, you got to do this. And I'm doing this. And, they come back in and they'd hold their work up. But people do, I've heard stories about people gathering in the yard or in the recreation room and talking and giving advice and feedback. Yeah, that goes on quite a bit. But as I say, it depends on how much access you have to other people. There's a really nice story. It's not about exactly what you're talking about, but one artist liked to do his work in the rec room, which is, a lot of people, they're playing poker and they're playing chess and they're drawing and getting their hair cut. And he had a spot at a table, and he had people that liked to be around him and watch him. And he said people would make comments, like if he was doing a painting of a farm and he'd never been on a farm, some guy from a farm in Michigan would say, no, man, you got the well over here. It shouldn't be there, and you got to put the thing over here. And, it became this whole group effort. And when the painting went off, when it went off to the exhibition, everybody would be like, yeah, I gave him the advice on the well, I told him about this or that. So, there's some nice exchange that goes on.
Fran had put a question in the chat about how many prisons are there? How does the art get to us? Do you want to talk a little bit about the art selection process, Janie?
Yeah, well, currently in Michigan, I think there are 28 prisons, right, Nora?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, when we started, there were 40 actually. So a lot of them have been consolidated or, just ended. So what was the question?
How the art gets to us, how we
So
select.
there's only one women's prison, which is right near us, half an hour away. And then all the rest are men's prisons, which are in both peninsulas of Michigan. We go around to all the prisons. We don't each go to every prison, although Graham, our coordinator, goes to almost all of them. But we now have 8 curators, so we split up. And some of us go to every prison where we select the art and we physically bring it back. And we have a studio space on campus where we store all the work. What was the other question?
Do you want to talk just about what a selection visit looks like, perhaps?
Oh, yeah. So the selection visits are really like the heart of the project. And they last from 2 to 3 hours, usually, depending on how many people are there. And so what we do is we walk in and there'll be, maybe they're 50, say they're 15 people. And the first hour is a kind of very unusual thing for prisons. We get to sort of walk around, look at the art and talk to each other and mingle in a way that is totally not doesn't happen. It's like the only time that this happens in prison. So it's a really great opportunity for the artists not only to talk with us, but to actually walk around and see each other's work, because they're only seeing the work that's in their own housing unit. So they get to walk around, and this is a great time for people to gather. And so that first hour, we try to make sure we see all the work and talk to everybody. And then the second phase, the artists go into a different space, and we as the curator group go around to every artist's work and make our selections. And at this point, we have so many artists that we can only take up to 2 pieces from each person. So we make our selections, and there's a lot of discussion that goes on. Should we take this one or that one or whatever? And then the artists, what we do in the third phase is we call each artist in individually. And those of us who have an art background or feel we can give the feedback to the artist do so. So we might have, say, 3 conversations going on in the room. I'm talking to this artist, Charlie's talking to that artist, Graham's talking to that artist. And that's where we say, this is what we've chosen. And then we have a conversation about the work. We've already had a conversation probably in the first hour, but we can continue that. They can ask questions. Sometimes with very experienced artists, particularly, we ask them to choose if we're having a hard time. We also ask some of the experienced artists to join us in our curatorial process. So yeah, that's what happens during the selection visit. So it's very intense because we only, we're on the clock, we have an hour for this phase and we have to make sure, there could be 50 people in there. So it's a lot of talking.
So we're at 8:30. So I wanted to invite someone to ask a final question, or, indicate in the chat and then unmute yourself. If there's someone who'd like to take advantage of that opportunity.
Dylan, you must have a question.
No question.
I just want to ask,
Hey, Janie.
when's the book coming out?
I don't know. I don't have a publisher yet. So
Janie, I got to say, I was struck tonight by the idea that a lot of your work is reflective. The idea that you open yourself as much as you ask others to show themselves. And I was struck by that. I find that beautiful. And I think yeah.
That's a great comment, Graham. Thank you.
Yeah.
The whole thing about mirroring.
Exactly. Yeah. That you're as open as you ask others to be of themselves, and you remain that way as you express your thoughts about their art. And I found that really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's something that Buzz did too. I think that it's a way to really make the situation equal and to have people being able to express themselves too.
I think I'm going to exercise my director's prerogative to ask a final question then. Janie, I'm wondering if, in the spirit of reflection, how has doing this work for 25 years changed you? What have been your most important transformations as a person, as an artist?
Yeah, a number of ways. As a person, when I first began this work, I thought, I kept saying, oh, this is so much work. It's so time consuming. It's taking away from my own art practice. And as I got further into it, and at some point I just realized that this was my work, and my art practice is my art practice. And I don't do as much art as other people who only do their art practice. But it stopped being a conflict for me. And partly it was because I felt like my own art practice was deeply affected by the work I was seeing in prisons. So for example, a lot of the work is really detailed, and I found myself really drawn to very detailed drawings with lots of mark making. And it reminded me that when I was young, I used to do that kind of work, and then I had gotten away from it. So I started doing that kind of work, and it changed my feeling about time. I stopped feeling like I have to, well, I didn't really feel this way, but I didn't care how long it took. I really got into that kind of laborious, time consuming, detailed work and found it very satisfying. And I think I felt a connection with the artists doing that kind of work. So it really, and now I'm not really doing that kind of work, but I still feel like overall, it just brought me more, and it gave me more access to my authentic self, what I want to be doing in my artwork and what I want to, be doing in my life too. But in my artwork, I think more of an ability to get to that. And yeah, it also widened my thinking about who my audience is that these hundreds of people in prison are partly, the audience in my head, as well as people in the art world externally. And what I said in the beginning about, feeling like I was seeing the missing pieces in our culture, that's another way I feel like I've been affected by this work, is just feeling more grounded. And I know that there's so many other people who do the same, who probably feel the same kind of thing. Even if you're seeing a lot of suffering, is a way that you feel more grounded to be having this wider vision of what our country really is.
Well, I think that's an absolutely beautiful note to end on. And please, everyone, join me again in thanking Janie for a really inspiring, transformative, enlightening lecture. Thank you so much, Janie. I'm so privileged to
Thank
do
you.
Well done.
And when will you post the recording?
I should be able to do it tomorrow. So the recording of this keynote will be on the digital show website, and I'll also plan to send a link out to everyone who had registered for the address.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. And if anyone wants to follow up with me, you can email me or any thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. And
thank you.
Yes, this time or 7 p.m. next Thursday, we will have a panel discussion among 4 PCAP artists. So please tune back in then. And in the meantime, please do spread the word about the digital show to your friends, your communities. We've had such a wonderful response, and I'm so grateful for everyone's comments and your attendance tonight. So thank you all.
And Janie,
Yes.
Shawnee just called me and asked a question that she had. And it was about if an artist enters prison and there's any attention they might gather as already an artist, and if you kind of have to deal with conflicts from attention sometimes, like from other prisoners maybe being frustrated in that way.
No,
Which Johnny was
I
wondering.
don't think too much. I didn't mention actually that most of the artists became artists in prison. They weren't artists before, most of them. They learned it in prison. But if you're an artist and you enter prison, I think most people would be interested in their work. They may ultimately feel competitive, as there is competition between artists in prison all the time, but it is mostly a friendly kind of competition. They generally are respectful of each other.
Great. Sorry, not to kind of end on the ending note.
No,
It's all
thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Nora, all
everyone.
the PCAP staff.
Janie.
Thank you so much. Thank
Have
you.
a lovely
It was
evening.
just wonderful. Thank you all.